Browser is over here. OGS. What do I have up? Cringe? Wonder what that is. We're not gonna risk it. I wonder what it was. Where's that rain stuff? Rain playlist? Opened image? Open playlist. Fuck, why is it so loud for me? Chrome. That would be why. This should be at like negative 17. That's good. And then we can turn this up. And get some music going. There was a patch. Wrong title. Wrong game. There's a patch. Patch? Find some music. What are we gonna listen to? Sean Angus Watson. And I'm hearing an echo. Thank you. Pal World is listed. It's not running, I don't think. Okay, let's go. Normal game. 19 by 19. I feel like there were a ton of cool videos from, I can't think of names, dude. Am I awake? Anton Petrov. Anton Petrov. Interstellar Brown Noise, the ultimate productivity hack. Oh, look at that.
Game started.
Huge legal issues of Trump's assassination with a start. Microscopic chariot where algae are the horses. Like, that's what we're looking for.
This is Anton. And this is one of those reviews that I should probably start.
Is that how I spell Anton Petrov? I'm not so sure about my ability to right anymore. This is wild. Bottom left. Default view.
With the video clip showing us what we're going to be discussing, and it's right there. That unusual triangular slash square-like shape moving around along with several other organisms. And in essence, what you're actually looking at is, to some extent, a tiny microscopic chariot. Yeah, like those chariots we use with horses. Except that in this case, we're not using horses, we're using microorganisms. And so today's topic is going to be maybe a little bit more unusual, but it's actually technically based on some of the initial propositions by the iconic Richard Feynman from back in 1959. And so let's, I guess, start there. In 1959, Richard Feynman, the brilliant physicist that passed away in 1988, held a lecture at Caltech with the title "There's Plenty of Room at the Bottom, an invitation to enter a new field of physics," with all this eventually published in a book you see right here that essentially focused on what you see right here, miniaturization, the eventual ability of humanity to manipulate matter on atomic scales and to eventually create some kind of tiny nanoscale machines that he basically compared to swallowing a doctor. So basically, a tiny molecular robot serving as a kind of a microsurgeon that can fix our bodies from within. And though back in 1959 this was essentially science fiction, today in 2024 we're technically slowly making it science reality. And that's because in the last decade or so, there's been a lot of progress in trying
really
to
wanna
create
fight over
these
this corner.
artificial micro swimmers.
So we're gonna
Basically tiny robots
pass it.
that have a huge potential in biomedical application and can easily perform a lot of complex tasks, but
For
do
this
so
corner and
from
then cover
within the
top.
body. But what Feynman did not realize, and what we actually realized in the last few decades, is that there are a lot of challenges we could not imagine. And interestingly, the biggest challenge so far is in regards to locomotion. And that's because once you get to these micro scales, a lot of liquids, such as for example water, become extremely viscous. It's measured in what's known as the Reynolds number. It's essentially a kind of a quantity that predicts various fluid flows in different situations. And so when this number is very low, the liquid tends to flow extremely slowly, whereas with the high Reynolds number, the flow tends to be very turbulent and very fast. And though for a typical person swimming in the water, this number is usually approximately 4 million,
Development here. What if we flip this around? What do you think about this? Do it this way. And we could have a larger board. Do it like that.
for a typical microorganism, it's usually much less than
Oh,
one.
but then we can't see the
Usually
video.
1 million
Doesn't
or
matter,
just
yeah.
a little bit higher. And so in order for anything small to swim in these conditions, the evolution had to evolve a lot of different techniques. For example, many different bacteria and quite a lot of different organisms use things like cilia and flagella. And these are basically hair-like protrusions that create locomotion by deforming waves along flagella or cilia and by essentially acting either like tiny arms or tiny propellers. And interestingly, the machinery inside of them is super complex as well. But basically by producing these rotational or beating motions, it allows the majority of microorganisms to propel themselves relatively fast. As a matter of fact, just as a side note, a few weeks ago I took my 5-year-old to collect some pond water so we can actually examine it under a microscope. And to our surprise, we discovered something that was moving super fast inside the water, so fast as a matter of fact, that we didn't even have enough time to snap a picture. And well, surprisingly, it was actually the organism that we're going to be discussing today. It's a very well-known algae known as Chlamydomonas reinhardti that seems to exist pretty much everywhere. In terms of structure and the appearance, it basically looks like this. And so in this recent study, the Japanese scientists discovered a very clever technique. they essentially created a micro swimmer by using the propulsion from these super fast moving algae. And what you're looking at right here is the result. But they did this by basically creating microscopic traps, or I guess a kind of a harness that can then be attached to a mobile robot in order to create propulsion by using a completely different organism. And surprisingly, it worked really well. Here, in every single case, they were able to create these moving chariots by trapping the algae inside of this tiny harness. And in terms of size, this is actually really small, roughly around 10 micrometers in size, attached to a tiny harness that was formed using micro 3D printing techniques, whose main purpose, at least for now, was to basically find out if it even works. First of all, can these harnesses trap the algae? And second of all, does the algae have enough power to then push everything around? And here they decided to conduct several experiments. In one of these 3D printed vehicles that are approximately 1/2 of human hair in thickness, this particular structure was spinning at a speed of 40 micrometers a second and was producing consistent locomotion. In the second device they refer to as the scooter, they were also moving around, but in very unusual, unpredictable ways, rotating and turning around, and even doing backflips as the structure was moving everywhere. And all of this was possible because these particular algae can actually move really fast, with these baskets allowing them to use their flagella by essentially having them stick out in front in the way you see right here. But unlike previous nanomachines, here this was all powered naturally. In a lot of previous examples, something had to power these machines, such as for example different types of light, but here the locomotion was natural and produced by the algae itself. And more importantly, this particular algae is technically safe to consume and can even produce its own energy and its own food by either using light or by even growing in darkness as long as they have enough sugars. And so these are actually really interesting organisms that in theory could survive inside dark environments and are very unlikely to be dangerous if put inside some kind of a tissue. Now obviously nobody's going to be injecting these yet. At this point this is still very preliminary research, but the results from this experiment are super exciting. Obviously they'll teach us more about locomotion of microorganisms, but it's really the potential to evolve this into some kind of a incredible medical technology that makes the study super exciting. And even if not for medical reasons, this could possibly be even used for example, environmental cleaning and to get rid of various pollutants in aquatic environments. So basically here imagine a tiny chariot that uses a nanomachine to, for example, break down plastics or remove certain pollutants that's entirely driven by various types of algae that live and thrive in these environments already. And this algae is actually incredible for so many reasons. For example, it also has an eye spot, and so technically it's possible to guide this algae by using certain frequencies of light. And so there's even a potential to control the motion of all of this and guide these chariots to a very specific destination. And so yeah, something to look forward to, and something we'll discuss in some of the future videos once there are some updates, or the scientists behind this study create something else super amazing. Until then, thank you for watching, subscribe, share this with someone who loves learning about space and sciences, come back tomorrow to learn something else, support this channel on Patreon by joining the channel membership, or by buying the Wonderful Person t-shirt you can find in the description. Stay wonderful, I'll see you tomorrow, and as always, bye bye.
I'm not sure what the fuck my shape is right here. At all. To be honest. Dude's 18K? Okay, that makes sense. Not even close to a fair game. If you ask me. If you ask me. Why am I so fucking bad?
White wins.
What was the end score? Black plus 22? That's a load of bullshit. There's no way. How the hell did I have more territory? I have this chunk of wall. Oh, I see. He just hadn't challenged anything over here. I don't even have really this chunk of wall. I have this. That's it. That. And this. A little bit. Is it just that he's super dense? He has a bunch of pieces that are diminishing my territory and technically alive, but not a lot of actual territory? I mean, I'm kind of the same. I don't know. Wasn't feeling it. Let's see. Premium. Other stuff to watch. Literally burns water as fuel. Massive Neuralink update. Alien or not? Why is ice so... Now these are the real important questions.
Hello wonderful person, this is Anton, and today we're going to discuss something a little bit more unusual, at least for this channel. We're going to discuss this report right here with a simple title, Analysis of a Metallic Specimen. And as you can probably tell from the title, it's kind of related to UFOs or UAPs, as they're known today. And specifically, it's about this. A somewhat nondescript piece of metal that for basically 80 years now is claimed to have been retrieved right after the 1940s.
Why can't I hear anything? It says it's playing, that's not right. No, that's not what I meant.
Game started.
That it, we got a little notification. Launched. Launched. Text to speech is broken. Huh. That it? We gotta relaunch this? Wait, this is a 19. Shit, not a 13. Whoops. My text to speech working? Still not. I don't know. We'll have to look into that later. I guess I just have to pay attention to chat today. Route. Okay, well, how do we make up for this 10-10 move? Don't fight for center. That's a mistake. I feel like I can play kind of aggressively against that. What's he gonna do? You saw it. I was tempted to resign. God damn.
Seven, Roswell incident. The incident, as many of you know, for many years has been speculated to essentially be some kind of a UFO conspiracy theory. And in this video, we're actually not going to talk about this incident pretty much at all. This particular piece has been claimed to have come from there and has obviously been claimed to have been extraterrestrial in origin, as in produced by aliens, not from some kind of a meteorite. Although realistically speaking, there is really no evidence for any of these claims, and so all of this was basically word of mouth. But nevertheless, for the first time ever, we now have an official chemical investigation finally determining what's inside of this and presenting evidence for where it probably came from and what exactly this is. And so in this video, let's basically discuss this from a scientific perspective and basically focus on the results and what exactly all of this means. Naturally though, in this video, I'm going to try to stay as unbiased as possible and not make any claims for the existence or non-existence of alien extraterrestrial intelligence. But first, it's really important to mention who's been investigating this and why this is actually an official scientific study. So back in 2022, the government established AARO, All Domain Anomaly Resolution Office, that's part of the Secretary of Defense, and whose main goal is to essentially investigate various anomalous reports, including UFOs or other unusual phenomena. And so yeah, this is basically the X-Files, for reals. Initially headed by Dr. Sean Kirkpatrick, a physicist and a professor at University of Georgia, who is quite interested in this phenomenon as well. But a few months back, in November of 2023, he essentially stepped down as a director, publicly stating that after 2 years, he found no evidence of aliens or any kind of a UFO cover-up, and that there was basically nothing for him left to do. But AARO still exists and is still trying to conduct additional studies, despite basically finding no empirical evidence for the existence of unidentified anomalous phenomena. This, by the way, was probably the most comprehensive recent scientific study on this phenomenon, with the results concluding that there is really nothing going on out there. But the point I'm trying to make here is that these were actual scientific studies focusing on evidence and facts and so far they found nothing. But when it comes to physical evidence, this one was actually pretty big. For many years, or really for many decades, this was alleged to be a component recovered from a crashed extraterrestrial vehicle back in 1947, and it was also allegedly exhibiting unusual properties associated with anti-gravity phenomenon. And these were obviously big claims and had to be physically investigated. And here I was super curious to find out how exactly people thought it works in terms of anti-gravity and what exactly is happening inside. And well, it turns out that initial analysis from many years ago determined that this is some kind of a magnesium alloy. And it was also claimed to contain an unusual crystalline structure of bismuth, which then turned it into something incredible. That crystal of bismuth apparently served as what's known as the terahertz waveguide. I'll explain in a second exactly what this is. But basically, by being this unusual terahertz waveguide, it was supposed to create unusual vibrations inside and produce anti-gravity effects, with all of this also able to reduce the inertial mass of the entire material, thus basically making it levitate above any surface. And all of this was claimed to come from bismuth crystals inside of this magnesium alloy. So yeah, big claims and pretty big words. And here we have to take a side note and briefly discuss terahertz frequencies and of course terahertz waveguides, the main claim behind this unusual material. So terahertz waves, also known as T-ray radiation, is the light frequency that's somewhere between microwave and optical wavelengths. And in the last few decades, it's actually generated huge amounts of interest for a lot of different industries, with the biggest two being telecommunication and medical fields. So, for example, when it comes to telecommunication, this would be essentially some kind of a 6th or even 7th generation technology being able to produce incredible speeds and achieve incredible bandwidth. But unlike radio frequencies, terahertz radiation is also usually absorbed by gases, including atmosphere, within just a few meters. And that's because terahertz frequencies are actually also associated with the natural vibration of various molecules. And so in terms of practical use for telecommunication, there are still a lot of shortcomings. But because this corresponds to the vibrational frequency of various molecules, especially large molecules, that will usually have very unique terahertz signatures, in theory, it can actually be used in medical fields to scan pretty much anything in regards to biology. In other words, terahertz frequencies present us with an opportunity for an incredible scanner, passing through pretty much most clothing and even packaging, and allowing us to see what's inside in terms of molecular composition. So basically think like an MRI scanner that can actually see every single molecule and determine what molecule it is. But despite these incredible promises, for essentially decades now, we've never really had any major breakthroughs yet, essentially placing terahertz frequencies into a kind of unexplored territory. It's basically located right between microwaves and infrared spectra, two well-developed frequencies that have been used in various technologies for many years. And so in some sense, terahertz waves are supposed to bridge the gap between microwaves and optical wavelengths. But trying to develop the technology that can actually control these waves, guide them, and also detect them easily has been kind of challenging. And so trying to discover this so-called terahertz waveguide, basically something that can help us transport these waves from one point to another easily, has been a source of many different studies for many decades. And specifically, for many decades, material scientists have been trying to discover this magical material that can serve as the waveguide for terahertz frequencies. Material that will be cheap and easy enough to produce, and that could easily guide these waves without causing major disruption. But I guess the question is, so why can't we just use some kind of a metal already, and why doesn't it actually work? Well, when it comes to metals, they can easily transmit microwave frequencies, but when it comes to terahertz frequencies, they unfortunately have an extremely high ohmic loss, or basically the resistance increases dramatically, which causes terahertz frequencies to drop off quite dramatically even over a short distance. Likewise, various polymers or even glasses usually work very well with optical frequencies and the infrared frequencies, but produce very high absorption losses when it comes to terahertz frequencies. And so finding the right material has basically been the biggest problem. And so naturally, when there's a claim that maybe there is a material that someone discovered somewhere out there that seems to be a perfect terahertz waveguide, that material would have to be investigated to determine if we finally found something that can actually work. And that's where this sample comes in. Like I mentioned previously, This was claimed to be a perfect terahertz waveguide, able to do all of this through some kind of a crystalline structure of bismuth inside this magnesium alloy. And this particular sample was finally sent to a government lab, specifically the Oak Ridge National Laboratory, back in 2022. And so now, after 2 years, the results were sent back to AARO, with the conclusion basically being that, first of all, definitely not aliens, and second of all, also not a terahertz waveguide either. And though this alloy was indeed made out of magnesium and did contain bismuth, it did not contain any crystalline structure, and the overall composition did not indicate that this has non-terrestrial origin. Or just to rephrase this, the conclusion here was that this was actually made on Earth and was actually an engineered alloy for very specific purposes. And so I guess the question is, but why? What's the purpose? Well, because we don't actually know the origin of this particular alloy, everything at this point is guesswork, but in this case, the actual guesswork doesn't make a lot of sense. So because this contains signs of engineering and very distinct layers of magnesium, zinc and bismuth, with the structures only microns in thickness, but also because this doesn't seem to be a very complex material and was not produced using technologies from the last few decades, here the suggestion is that this was most likely produced sometime during or before the Second World War, when the United States saw a tremendous research and a lot of domestic interest in trying to produce some kind of an alloy for various airframes, engines, weapons, and even rockets, using different types of alloys. And so sometimes between 1915 and the end of World War II, a lot of this research was focused on magnesium alloys. All of this is mentioned in that study you can find in the description. But many of these experimental alloys failed for different reasons, such as, for example, various types of corrosion and various types of cracks during stress testing of materials in order to see if they can survive various stressful environments a typical airplane experiences on an annual basis. But at the same time, a lot of these tests and a lot of records of these tests have been actually lost, especially if those experiments failed. And because of this, it's impossible to verify the historical origin of this little piece. But because we know that early research did focus on magnesium, but eventually magnesium turned out to be not a good alloy, this potentially explains why this piece exists, why we don't actually know much about it, because it was basically a failed test, but more importantly, why magnesium alloys are generally not really used in aviation anymore. And though obviously this is maybe a bit of a speculation on the part of researchers, right now this is indeed the only reasonable explanation we have for what exactly this is. But I guess most importantly, no unusual properties and no unusual emissions were detected anywhere, and this is definitely not some kind of a super material containing perfect crystals. Instead, it seems to be a decades-old alloy from some kind of a failed experiment. With all of this further confirmed using isotope analysis, comparing this to various meteorites and various modern alloys, overall confirming its terrestrial origins, and most importantly, origins from the solar system, because the isotope composition was identical to everything else we have on Earth, including various meteorites. And because this analysis was extremely rigorous and involved multiple layers of research for basically like 2 years now, I don't think there's really anything else left to add. This is extremely likely some kind of a test object, possibly a product or a byproduct of early manufacturing from 1930s, 1940s, and was most likely part of research in aerospace industry. Industry that at first focused on magnesium before switching to other alloys. So yeah, unfortunately, not aliens, not extraterrestrial or extrasolar in origin, and unlikely to have come from 1947 Roswell incident. But you can read all of this by yourself in all of the links in the description below. And so yeah, definitely a cool study, and I guess a cool conclusion to this unusual piece, but it's unlikely to change a lot of minds when it comes to ufologists, as I've learned the hard way when I initially tried to make a lot of UFO videos back in the days. Anyway, on that note, once there are some additional discoveries in regards to this topic, we'll come back and talk more about this, but only if it's super scientific and does involve rigorous studies. And so anyway, on that note, thank you for watching, subscribe, share this with someone who loves learning about space and sciences, come back tomorrow to learn something else, support this channel on Patreon by joining the channel membership, or by buying the wonderful person t-shirt you can find in the description.
Ice is weird. Just by holding together 2 blocks of ice, only for a second, they fuse to become a single object. This, as a property of solids, is reasonably uncommon, at least in my experience. So how is this possible? Let me know what you think, but the answer is more complicated than it seems, and it relates to another strange property of ice that occurs at its surface, its seemingly
You
unreasonable
have won.
level of slipperiness.
Oh,
We have been debating the quirks of ice's surface for a long time, but to get a good
so I won? That's what we're looking at. Is that what you're talking about, or are you talking about this? This is my desktop, kind of trippy. That can be a little bit distracting, the top left. And then this is educational YouTube videos about ice. Ice. We finally learned why ice is slippery. I never knew that we didn't know, but now I know. Now we're gonna find out why it is slippery.
good understanding of it, you really want to be able to see what the individual water molecules are doing. This sounds obviously like it should be impossible, and it has been until now. The research team has just released their findings in the scientific journal Nature, collected using a technique that is so sensitive it can feel the spaces between
You learned that
individual
aliens don't
atoms,
exist
and
in the last
produced
video?
for the very
We're kinda
first
on a roll
time
here.
a
We
picture
learn a lot of
of
this stuff.
ice's surface. But to really understand what this picture
At
tells us
Roswell?
and why
Actually,
ice
I'm
is
not sure if
slippery,
you can trust
we
that,
need to
'cause-
rewind by about 160 years.
Pause. We just had a dramatic moment in the video. What was it? So, government lab researched material from Roswell and said, nope, no aliens. So, can you trust that? It's a government lab.
On its surface, ice being slippery makes sense. When water is spilled on the floor, it becomes a slip hazard. We reason this is because water creates a mobile barrier between our foot and the floor, almost like stepping on a bunch of marbles that tumble along and cause you to slip.
A lot of
You might
people
guess
feel
maybe
like
ice
trusting
is
the
so slippery
government's
because
kind
it
of a
too is
mistake.
covered in a thin layer
You know, we
of
trust the
liquid
government
water.
with our taxes,
Maybe the
and we're
answer
like,
is
how
as
many
simple
trillion
as that.
dollars?
In fact, in the late
Or is it
1850s,
quadrillion?
Michael
I don't
Faraday,
even
one of
know.
the most influential scientists
debt
in history, particularly across electromagnetism
to
and
ourselves
electrochemistry,
in the
tried
banking
this exact experiment
industry. I don't know,
and
man.
concluded the very same thing, which he announced in a talk at the Royal Society. However, there is a problem with this theory. If you conduct this experiment under extreme vacuum, where no liquid layer can be present because liquid water molecules would have evaporated away
China
as there is no
somehow.
atmosphere
China
holding
buys
them
our
down,
debt.
then ice
Don't really
still
understand
remains
that
slippery.
process, I'm gonna
So
be
what's
honest.
actually happening?
Believe it or not, ice science was all the rage through the mid-1800s to early 1900s, partially inspired by the other observation we've all made: water as a liquid is denser
Game
than water as
started.
a solid, which is why ice floats on liquid water.
This, it turns out, is a really rare property across materials, with bismuth being one of the very few similar exceptions. For water, this is the result of the crystal structure water forms as it freezes. The hydrogen bonds that rapidly connect and disconnect from nearby neighbours in liquid water. As it begins to freeze, the molecules of H2O arrange to form bonds in such a way they create additional space between the molecules. So the same volume of water expands by about 10% as it goes from liquid to solid. In the 1850s, James Thomson, an Irish mathematician and engineer, was examining the change from liquid to solid and noticed that the freezing temperature changed based on atmospheric pressure. Thomson was one of the inspirations of the field of thermodynamics, something I'll never personally forgive him for, but his work did lead us to developing this useful, if somewhat complicated looking, phase diagram of water's behaviour. Here we see what Thomson saw. We can cause ice to melt and become water either by increasing the temperature or by increasing the pressure. Maybe ice can be slippery in a vacuum even if its liquid layer evaporates away, because as soon as we go to touch it to measure its slipperiness, the pressure of that touch melts the surface and creates a newly slippery liquid layer. In 1886, John Joly followed the same reasoning to suggest how ice skaters might glide across frozen lakes. Joly suggested that the pressure of a thin ice skate's blade is so great because it touches ice on such a small area that it melts the ice to water, creating a slipping layer. In theory, a good suggestion, earning him the nickname John Bon Joly.
However, while the basic idea is correct, you can melt ice by pressurizing it, the numbers don't really work at all.
A 150-pound person standing on ice wearing a pair of ice skates exerts a pressure of roughly 50 pounds per square inch on the ice. That amount of pressure lowers the melting temperature from 0 to minus 0.016666, repeating. degrees Celsius, or for Americans 32 degrees Fahrenheit down to 31.97 degrees Fahrenheit. If this explanation was in fact correct, light objects or ones with large surface area like a hockey puck or a ski would create even lower pressure and shouldn't slip at all. And that's a problem because in fact we see the exact opposite. Many winter sports are best below freezing temperature. Figure skaters prefer minus 5.5 degrees Celsius for a slower, softer ice to land their tricks on, whereas hockey players like the cold, hard and fast conditions of minus 9 degrees Celsius. Speed skaters like somewhere in between at minus 7 degrees C. This is also disproved as a primary mechanism by our first experiment. When we press two blocks of ice together, they freeze. Why would an ice skate against ice become slippery, but ice against ice freezes? Despite this hypothesis' shortcomings, it remains the dominant explanation of slipperiness of ice for over a century, including many YouTube videos about it. So, if pressure is not responsible, what else could be? Maybe it's heat generated from friction. Two surfaces in contact moving relative to each other produce heat. Could this heat be melting the ice to form the slippery liquid layer?
Now this will of course happen to some extent, but most practical experience tells us we don't have to be moving much to slip.
Instead, it feels very much like the phenomenon that is producing this slipping is already present without pressure and without friction and without heating being required. If this idea of a liquid water layer can't fully explain why ice is so slippery, maybe it's something that behaves like a liquid, but isn't one, and isn't a solid either. When we described the freezing of water into ice, we talked about the hydrogen bonds aligning within the bulk material to create a solid, less dense than the liquid phase, where all of the molecules were held in rigid formation, supported by the network of surrounding molecules which are similarly locked in position. This is true everywhere within a solid except for at the surface, where the supportive crystal structure extends below, but above, the outermost layer of water molecules interact with nothing but the atmosphere, or whatever object they come in contact with. It was at this surface that researchers directed their focus, using a piece of equipment called an atomic force microscope, or AFM, which here is a no-expense spared mock-up of one. The AFM has a long cantilever, about 100 to 500 microns long, or about the length of the diameter of two human hairs side by side. It's about 30 to 50 microns wide, which is half of the diameter of a grain of sand, and around 0.5 to 0.8 microns thick, which is about the thickness of a red blood cell. I used AFM probes a lot in my PhD, and although they are metal, they are so thin that it's better to think of them as a blade of grass fluttering on the wind than a piece of metal. At the end of the cantilever there is a tip that is usually triangular and goes from quite wide at its base to at its end point just the width of a single atom. You could argue very reasonably that AFM tips are the sharpest objects in the world. This AFM probe is attached to the atomic force microscope itself, which then drags the probe along the atomic surface of a material, here represented by these marbles in a tray, and it measures, or really feels, the change in height of the tip as it travels over the surface of the individual atoms. But how do you sense or feel the bump of going over just a single atom, even though the height change is absolutely tiny? By reflecting a laser beam off of the back of the cantilever and detecting the position of that laser beam a long way away, this amplifies the up and down motion of the cantilever and allows you to measure the bump of going over an atom as well as the gaps in between atoms on a surface. This produces images of atoms that look like this. The research team conducted their experiment at minus 150 degrees C and in a near perfect vacuum, with at the very tip a single carbon monoxide molecule. Under normal conditions, they found that the water molecules are arranged like this, in layers of hexagons stacked one on top of the other, a phase of ice called IH for hexagonal ice. This ice type typically features the oxygen molecule of the H2O facing outward. However, there are also small clusters of a secondary ice type, cubic in nature, called IC, no pun intended, and the interesting thing happens at the boundaries between these two ice phases. Rather than the neatly arranged uniform oxygen facing outward molecular orientation, As these two types of ice don't nicely interface together, there's a perimeter of water molecules between the two that aren't quite sure whether to orient in a hexagonal or cubic structure, and so kind of end up doing their own thing, usually pointing their hydrogen atom outward away from the ice's surface. This is the very first time we've been able to image the surface of ice to this level of detail and see exactly the orientations of the atoms within the water molecules. But what do these
Wild.
findings actually mean? This break in structure, this disorder, not prevented
We
or
kill this?
tamed like it is deeper
Not
within the
joined.
solid, creates a collection
one
of
eye.
loosely bound molecules on the surface
You
of
can
the
connect
ice, only
somewhere,
held by a
no
reduced
doubt.
number
This
of
thing's
hydrogen
dead.
bonds. The suggestion is
Now he's
that
got
these
two
loosely
eyes.
bound molecules can move with freedom
All there was
not
to it.
usually experienced by a solid, but aren't quite as free as a liquid either. This quasi-liquid layer may detach and reattach to the surface, acting as we first imagined, like a layer of marbles able to shift and move, creating one of the only solids in the world that slips. But the story is more complicated still. As I looked at these images, there was something that confused me. If you've run an AFM before, you'll be thinking the same thing. How do you drag your AFM tip over something that's slipping around on the surface? During my PhD, I used to image nanoparticles on glass surfaces that I hoped were fixed in place, but sometimes they would detach, and what I would image would be a flat plane with a sudden
we can.
and long line in it as I dragged the atoms
Not
along
possible.
with the movement of the tip. Why don't we see these water molecules slipping around like the marbles that we described them to be? I had to dig around to find out, but I found a research paper that gives us a clue. Back in 2018, a team of researchers led by Professor Daniel Bonn from the University of Amsterdam, through macroscopic friction experiments at temperatures ranging from 0 Celsius to minus 100 degrees Celsius, showed that surprisingly, ice goes from extremely slippery as a surface at around 0 degrees C to a high friction surface at minus 100 degrees Celsius. This is why the AFM experiment, conducted at an even colder minus 150, was able to capture such a clear image. It's so cold here, the slippery water molecule marbles are frozen in place. These AFM images also reveal something else. As the
Fuck.
researchers increased the temperature, the cubic phase grew
No, we
across
knew
the
it. We're
surface.
alive.
As the temperature increased, the increased thermal energy drives a change in the mobility of the topmost water molecules. This matches the temperature dependence of the measured change in friction from that 2018 paper. This phenomenon is part of a process called pre-melting, the process that happens before solid ice melts into liquid water. And actually, upon melting, as soon as a real liquid layer forms on it actually becomes less slippery, as the highly structured solid ice becomes more easily deformed. The experiments from 2018 showed that the slipperiness of ice is actually at its maximum at minus 7 degrees Celsius, the temperature typically used in speed skating rinks. Putting this all together, this is a very complicated answer to a very simple question of why is ice slippy? It's a solid with an outermost layer that is free to move like marbles across its surface, liquid like in nature, but actually when a liquid layer is present, that becomes less slippery than the solid. An incredibly uncommon behavior from one of the most common materials on Earth. I love that sometimes it's the simplest questions that make us scratch our heads the hardest. If you like this video, you might be interested in a similar simple question with an answer that we actually aren't quite sure about. Where does gold actually come from? As always, thank you very much for watching. I'll see you next week. Goodbye.
Shit,
Okay,
that
do
should
you
have
know
gone
how
right
hard
there.
it was to get these two ice cubes to actually stick together? You have to
Save
become
the
a
point.
single block. They stick. Well, to become a single block. My fingers are so cold. Block. They don't stick. What's happening? They turn into a
think he's just costing himself points here.
Pass.
Any more neutrals?
Remove the dead stones.
That one right there. That was neutral.
LEDs don't get their color from their plastic covers. And you can see that because here is a transparent LED that also glows
You
the
have
same
won.
red color. The
Huge. All right.
color of the light comes from the
What are we gonna do real quick? I think that's it. Getting close to 6 to 8. Wow, dude. You just got in here. 726. Neutrals don't matter. That's valid. What I was trying to do was, I noticed he was closing up his own territory every time that I made a move. So I was trying to find if there weren't any more like pets to prevent / places to attack. There weren't really any more places to attack. I wanted to use neutral moves to see if he would fill in his own spaces, because I wasn't 100% certain that I won. So if he was going to cost himself points in order to not pass, I was going to try to capitalize on that. I'm probably going to call it a day here. I'm probably going to play like Pal World over the weekend, being honest. I'm not feeling go at this time of day right now. Maybe I will. I don't know. We'll find out. We'll see. Yeah, normally, because I've played that guy before, I feel like he knows. I don't know. I feel like that's something he would have known. Maybe he was having an off day. Good question. But I was gonna capitalize anyway. Alright. You have a good day, man. Sorry to leave. Yeah, it's kind of weird, because if I start at 6 o'clock, people don't usually roll in for like an hour or two. So if I'm going like 6 to 8, yeah. Maybe he saw bot due to those Chinese rules. Would Chinese rules not count that as his territory? I counted that as his territory. Is that just because I've been playing Japanese rules all this time? Shit, there was an ad. Yeah, thanks for dropping by. I don't know if the ad's still running. Thanks for dropping by. I'll be, I don't know, man. 6 to 8 is a tight window. I'm just tired as fuck. Maybe it's because I worked today. Maybe I'll be able to stay up later tomorrow. Hope so. Let's see. Sayonara, hasta la vista.